She sleeps with her rifle. That's the first thing they said about her. Not her name, not her record, not the fact that she'd been assigned to their unit by someone 3 pay grades above anyone in that room. Just that she sleeps with her rifle. Delivered with a laugh, like a punchline, like something that settled the question of who she was before she'd fired a single round. Captain Marcus Hale said it first. The rest of the room laughed on cue. 12 hours later, every man who survived would remember exactly what they'd said, and spend the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. If you've never heard of Sergeant Elena Cross, you're not alone. Most people haven't. That's exactly the point. Subscribe to the channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. Hit the like button, stay until the end, and I promise you, this one will change how you see people forever. The helicopter set down at Forward Base Iron Ridge at 0340 hours, and nobody came to meet it. That wasn't unusual. Iron Ridge was a forward operating base in the most technical sense of the term, a cluster of prefabricated structures bolted to the frozen shoulder of a mountain in a corner of the world that didn't appear on most maps. The kind of place where the wind had teeth, where the cold wasn't weather, it was a presence, something that pushed against you from all directions at once, looking for the gap between your collar and your jaw, between your sleeve and your glove, between your resolve and whatever kept you sane. The generators ran all night, less for warmth than for the electronics that kept the base from going blind. The lights inside the operations hut were always on. The coffee was always terrible. Nobody complained about either one. The helicopter that landed wasn't a logistics run. It wasn't medevac. It was a personnel transfer. 1 passenger, 1 duffel bag, 1 hardshell case roughly the length of a man's torso but considerably narrower. The loadmaster didn't help her with the case. She didn't ask him to. Staff Sergeant Elena Cross stepped off the ramp into the mountain dark and stood for a moment in the rotor wash, her face turned slightly away from the worst of it, her eyes already moving across the base. Not frantically, not with the wide-eyed alertness of someone new and nervous, just looking. The way you look at something when you're trying to understand it rather than impress it. She was 31 years old, 5'6", 138 pounds in full kit, 120 without. Her hair was the color of old timber, cut close enough that a helmet sealed properly without adjustment. Her eyes were dark gray. Not dramatically so, not the kind of eyes a novelist would describe as stormy. More like the color of concrete on a cloudy day. Functional, giving nothing. She picked up the hard-shell case, threw the duffel over her left shoulder, and walked toward the lights. The operations hut smelled like burn bags and instant oatmeal and the specific brand of boredom that accumulates when elite soldiers have been sitting in one place long enough to start getting philosophical. Shadow Platoon had been at Iron Ridge for 11 days. They were supposed to have rotated out after 7. The mission that was supposed to take them home had stalled in the intelligence cycle. One of those situations where everyone agreed something was probably happening, but nobody could prove it fast enough for the lawyers at Theater Command to authorize action. So they waited, and waited. And the kind of men who had been selected, trained, and deployed for their ability to solve violent problems at speed had spent 11 days doing PT, cleaning weapons, playing cards, and quietly losing their minds. There were 14 of them in the main room when Elena walked in. A few were actually asleep, which was impressive given the noise level. Someone had a laptop running a movie in the corner, 2 operators were arguing about the best way to treat a blister in cold weather, and Chief Petty Officer Ray Kowalski was attempting to teach himself guitar from a YouTube tutorial, badly, on a travel-size acoustic that someone's wife had sent in a care package as a joke. Elena didn't announce herself. She looked for the TOC board, the Tactical Operations Center whiteboard where current assignments and personnel rosters were chalked in, found it on the far wall, and walked to it. "Help you?" The voice came from the card table. The man attached to it was long and loose-limbed, the kind of build that looked deceptively relaxed until you noticed the thickness in his shoulders and the way he sat. Not slumped, but coiled. Dark stubble. A coffee mug with the handle broken off. He was watching her the way you watch someone you've already made a decision about. "Just getting oriented," Elena said, without turning from the board. "Oriented to what? You lost?" "No. 'Cause the medevac hut is 2 buildings south if you're looking for—" "I'm not looking for medevac." She turned then. "I'm looking for the Shadow Platoon roster. Is this it, or is there an updated version?" The room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Not silence. The movie was still running in the corner, Kowalski's guitar was still twanging, but the quality of attention had shifted. People were watching now. The man at the card table set his mug down. "Who are you?" "Cross. Sergeant Elena Cross. Attached effective tonight by order of—" "Wait." He held up a hand. Not rudely, more like he needed a second. "You're the attachment? From where, HQ? You're the one they sent us?" That would appear to be correct. Someone in the back of the room laughed. Not meanly. It had a genuine quality, like an involuntary response to something absurd. Elena didn't look toward it. She found her name on the roster, already written in, and studied the assignment next to it. Overwatch element, Bravo position. She noted the grid reference. Filed it. "I'm Kowalski," the guitar man said, making no effort to stop playing. "What's your MOS?" "Sniper." "How many deployments?" "Few." Few meaning that's not relevant to the current op. She looked at him directly. "What time is the captain's brief?" Kowalski stopped playing. He and the card table man exchanged a look. 0600, the card table man said. "Captain Hale runs it." "Good." Elena picked up her duffel and her hard-shell case. "Where's the bunk assignment?" "Well," she spent 40 minutes settling into her rack. Or rather, she spent 40 minutes doing what looked like settling in, but was actually something else entirely. She opened the hard-shell case first. Inside, nested in custom-cut foam, was a rifle that several men in that room would have recognized immediately as expensive, and would have struggled to describe accurately. It was a bolt-action configuration, suppressor-ready, with a chassis system in flat dark earth that had been modified in ways that weren't standard even for purpose-built precision rifles. The scope alone cost more than most operators' first cars, but the most notable thing about the rifle, if you studied it closely, was how used it looked. Not abused, cared for, but genuinely, thoroughly used. The kind of wear that comes from thousands of hours of actual use in actual conditions. The stock showed hard contact scars. The bipod legs had been replaced at least once. The turret caps had been retaped. This was not a display piece. Elena field stripped it with her eyes closed. Not for show, not because anyone was watching, but because it was faster that way when your hands already knew every surface. She laid the components across a cloth on her bunk and went through each one by touch and light, checking the bolt face for fouling, running a patch through the bore, testing the trigger pull with a weight gauge she kept in a side pocket of the hard case. She noted that the ejector spring had the faintest hesitation. Not enough to cause a malfunction, but enough that she added it to a mental list. She checked the scope's zero adjustments, noted they were exactly where she'd left them, made no changes. Then she reassembled the rifle, checked the assembled function, and placed it beside her on the bunk rather than leaning it against the wall. She was asleep in 6 minutes. She was awake at 0545 without an alarm. The base was already stirring, boots on plywood, someone heating water on a camp stove, the distant groan of a generator cycling up. Elena washed her face, dressed in full uniform including her kit, performed an abbreviated stretching routine that would have looked odd to anyone watching, one-leg balances, specific neck rotations, controlled breathing that she held for exactly 4 counts, and was in the operations hut at 0558. Captain Marcus Hale arrived at U604. He was everything the base had prepared her for, and nothing she hadn't already cataloged from a distance. 37 years old. Former Ranger, then SEAL, then hand-selected for a specialized task unit that operated in a gray zone between conventional special operations and something that didn't have an official name. He was physically commanding, 6'2", built like someone who never stopped competing even in the gym, with the kind of bearing that said, "I've walked into rooms where people were shooting and I've always walked back out." He had a clean record, several decorations for valor, and a reputation inside the community for being exactly the kind of aggressive, initiative-driven officer that higher headquarters loved until the moment he disagreed with their assessment, at which point they found him difficult. He was also, Elena noted, someone who had never spent more than 4 days waiting for anything. He scanned the room when he entered, found her immediately. "Cross?" "Sir." He looked at her the way men look at things that don't fit their expectation of what something should look like. Not contempt exactly, more like suspension of judgment pending further data. Where are you coming from? I'm not cleared to discuss previous assignments, sir. A pause. Short, controlled. Right. He moved to the board. You'll be on overwatch for Frozen Talon. Bravo position. Grid is on the board. It's elevated, isolated, approximately 800 meters from the primary objective. Your job is eyes on the eastern approach and support by fire if we have clean fields. Understood. What's the lateral distance to Alpha position from Bravo? Why? Because if Alpha takes casualties and needs support, I want to know if Bravo has a viable angle, or if I'm repositioning. Hale looked at her again. Slightly different look this time. Alpha position isn't in play. We're not expecting contact on approach. What's the intel confidence level? 70%. Elena said nothing. Something wrong with 70%? No, sir, she said. What's the lateral distance? Someone in the room, she didn't look to see who, made a sound that might have been amusement or might have been something else. Hale gave the distance. Elena noted it. The brief ran another 20 minutes. She asked 3 more questions, each precise, each ignored in the manner of questions that get answered with a slight recalibration of eye contact rather than actual information. She absorbed everything anyway. What was said, what wasn't said. The gap between the two. After the brief, Kowalski fell into step beside her as she moved back through the hut. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I thought those were good questions. They were basic questions. Yeah, he said. That's what I mean. But she ate alone, not because no one sat with her. Kowalski tried, briefly, before getting pulled into a gear inspection, but because her version of eating was functional rather than social. MRE main, 1 protein bar, 16 ounces of water, done in 9 minutes. She spent the remaining time before movement studying the terrain map for the Black Ravine sector. Not the digital version on the planning tablet, the paper topographic map, which showed contour lines rather than photographic detail and required actual understanding of the land rather than just looking at it. She traced the canyon walls with her finger, noted the elevation change from the valley floor to Bravo position, noted 3 potential secondary shooting positions within 200 meters of Bravo in case the first was compromised, noted the prevailing wind direction based on the temperature gradient indicated by shadow patterns in the satellite imagery she'd studied on the flight in. Made a note about the time of civil twilight and the degree of ambient illumination at 0430. Petty Officer Second Class Dennis Callahan watched her do this from across the room without intending to stare. He was 26, the second youngest in the platoon, and had developed the habit common to young operators of judging everything through the lens of what the most senior people around him thought. Hale had been mildly dismissive. Kowalski was openly curious. Callahan hadn't decided. He decided to say something. The terrain's pretty rough up at Bravo, he offered. Elena didn't look up. I know. Last unit that used that position had to rope traverse the last 60 meters. What was their load? What? Their kit weight. What were they carrying? He blinked. I don't know. Standard assault kit, I guess. Then it's not relevant to my situation. He started to move away. She said without looking up, Thanks for the heads up, though. He stopped, turned. She was still looking at the map. He nodded at the back of her head and went back to his gear. Captain Hale made the comment in the late afternoon, in that hour before pre-mission prep when the base ran at a particular frequency of nervous energy and people filled the silence with talking. He was with Staff Sergeant Jake Reyes and Petty Officer Callahan, leaning against the exterior wall of the equipment hut. The 3 of them conducting the kind of casual officer-senior NCO conversation that was really a debrief of moods and impressions. Hale had his coffee. Reyes had a protein bar he was eating without tasting. Callahan had shown up uninvited and stayed because no one told him to leave. The attachment, Hale said. Cross, Reyes said. She actually sleeps with her rifle. He said it with the tone of a man reporting evidence in a case he'd already decided. I went past the bunk room an hour ago. Rifle's right there on the mattress next to her. Reyes didn't respond. That was interesting. Elena cataloged it later. Reyes didn't laugh. He just ate his protein bar. Callahan, feeling the weight of the moment, produced a sound that was meant to be a laugh and landed somewhere short of it. Obsession, Hale continued. That or she's got attachment issues they didn't screen out properly. Either way, HQ sends me someone like that. I'm not putting her at Alpha. She's out at Bravo where she can't cause problems. She sees something good. Great. She doesn't. We still complete the mission. Reyes looked out at the mountains. What's her record say? What I could access. 2 deployments, no citations, in the visible jacket. Could be sanitized. Could be there's nothing to sanitize. He shrugged. We'll see. He pushed off the wall and went back inside. Reyes stood there a moment longer, looking at the place where the mountains went dark against the sky. Callahan waited to see if he would say something. Reyes didn't. He folded the protein bar wrapper very carefully and put it in his pocket. The pre-mission brief at 2D100 hours was tighter, faster, and sharper in tone. The switch from planning to execution had flipped, and the room felt it. Weapons were staged. Kit was laid out in pre-flight configuration. The air tasted like weapon oil and adrenaline, and the particular focused silence of men who had done this enough times that they'd found a private frequency to exist on during the hours before action. Elena sat at the far end of the briefing table. She'd spent the preceding 2 hours doing something that nobody in the room had seen her do before. She'd gone outside, alone, in the dark, and stood at the edge of the base where the ground dropped away toward the valley. She'd stood there for 45 minutes, very still, with her eyes closed. Callahan had seen her from a window and was about to go ask if she was all right when she turned and walked back inside, and something in her movement stopped him. She looked the same as always, quiet, still. But something about the quality of that stillness had changed, like a surface that's been under pressure and has reached the point where it's either going to hold or shatter. It was holding. In the brief, Hale walked them through the movement plan. 2-element approach up the canyon. Alpha element, 11 operators including Hale, would push to the objective compound. Bravo element, which was Elena, alone, would occupy the elevated overwatch position and maintain comms with Alpha. Expected movement to Bravo is approximately 90 minutes given terrain, Hale said. Cross, you'll need to be in position before Alpha reaches the canyon floor. I'll need 90 minutes to position and settle, Elena said, so I'll step off at H-2 hours. That's 30 minutes before Alpha. Yes, sir. I want you radio checked every 30 minutes. If you lose comms, abort Overwatch and exfil to rally point Kilo. Understood. What's my authority for fire? Fire at unambiguous threat to element. You see a weapon pointed at my guys, you engage. Unclear situations, you report and wait for confirmation. Elena held his gaze a half-second longer than she needed to. Understood. What she didn't say, and what she had noted from the map, from the terrain study, from the satellite imagery, from everything she'd absorbed in the past 22 hours, was that the engagement authority he'd just outlined was too restrictive for the kind of threat environment the Valley could generate if the intelligence was wrong. And she had strong private opinions about that 70% confidence level. She didn't say any of it. She checked her kit one final time, confirmed 0 on her rifle with a chamber flag check, swapped her batteries on every device that had them, ate a partial protein bar she didn't want because the next guaranteed eating opportunity was 14 hours away, and stepped outside into the Black Mountain cold at 0130 hours. She heard, as she cleared the door, Hale's voice behind her, loose and easy. Try not to sleepwalk off a cliff with that thing. Laughter. Familiar, relaxed, the kind that fills a room when someone with authority has made a joke and everyone understands what the appropriate response is. Elena walked into the dark. The approach to Bravo position was not 90 minutes. It was 111 minutes, because the last section of the route, a frost-slicked rock face above a 40-meter drop, required 3 attempts before she found a traverse line that her load would allow safely. She was carrying 63 pounds of kit in addition to her weapon system, and the previous unit's rope attachment point had pulled from the rock face sometime in the intervening weeks, which meant she was improvising on a cliff face above a drop she couldn't see the bottom of, in the dark, in wind that gusted to maybe 30 knots. She didn't curse, didn't panic. She slowed down, rethought the problem from the available anchor points, found a different line, traversed it. She reached Bravo position at 0321 hours, set up the rifle in the firing position she'd identified from the imagery, and began her observation sequence before the sweat on her back had time to cool. Bravo was a rocky shelf tucked into a crevice in the cliff face, essentially a natural blind, wide enough for one person in a prone firing position, with forward cover provided by a cluster of fractured stone. The field of view was excellent, approximately 200 degrees of arc across the valley floor and the near slopes, including the mouth of the canyon where Alpha would emerge. The shooting distance to the objective compound was approximately 940 meters. The distance to the most likely threat axis from the eastern approach was somewhere between 11 and 1200. She noted the wind. She arranged the key terrain features with her laser rangefinder and committed the numbers to the notepad. Beside her, 847 to the compound wall, 1,183 to the far ridge, 1,340 to a prominent boulder formation on the north slope that she'd already identified as a potential covered position for anyone wanting to control the canyon. She ranged that boulder formation 4 times, not because she was uncertain, because something about it kept pulling her attention back. She keyed her radio at 0345 and gave the status call. Kestrel 1, Bravo Actual, position set, observation initiated. Hale's voice came back clipped and controlled. Copy, Bravo. Alpha is at H-40. Copy. She settled in. The cold was serious. She registered it the way you register background noise, noting it without letting it take up space in the foreground of her attention. She pulled the rifle close against her shoulder, not in a firing posture, but in the position she'd developed over years for extended cold weather observation. The barrel along her right arm, the stock anchored, the scope live, but her eye resting slightly off the glass to preserve night vision rather than exhausting it. The mountains were huge and dark and almost perfectly silent. She waited. And something in the way the darkness sat over that boulder formation on the north slope, the way no wind-driven snow moved across its face the way it did across every other exposed rock surface, made a thought form at the back of her mind that she didn't push away. She ranged it again. 1,338 meters. She made a note. Alpha element hit the canyon mouth at 0453 hours, moving in good order, intervals correct, pace disciplined despite the terrain. Elena tracked them on thermal, not from anxiety, but from the same systematic attention she'd given every other sector. She noted Hale at the front of the element, which was tactically aggressive and probably not wrong given that he knew this terrain from the planning map and someone needed to make the calls at the front. She noted the intervals between men, noted the 2 element spread they shifted to once inside the canyon walls, noted the way Callahan moved, slightly right-heavy with his footfall, compensating for something, maybe a blister on his left heel from the cold weather boots. She noted all of this and then moved her thermal back to the north slope. The boulder formation was still wrong. She couldn't have explained it yet in a way that would survive an after-action report. Just wrong. The way a room is wrong when you walk into it and can't immediately identify what's changed, but something has. She keyed the radio. Kestrel 1, Bravo, query on northern slope, grid. She read off the coordinates. Elevation echo. I have anomalous thermal signature at that location. Advise. Hale's voice came back tight and fast. Negative, Bravo. Intel shows that sector clear. Don't clog the net. She released the key. She looked at the boulder formation for another 3 seconds. Then she went back to observation. Full sector scan. Canyon floor. Canyon walls. Compound approach. Eastern axis. Northern slope. Compound approach. Eastern axis. Northern. The canyon behind Alpha element detonated. Not a single blast. A sequence detonation, 3 charges minimum, time to bracket the trail, and collapse the egress route. The sound arrived at Bravo position a half second after the light, a low concussive thump that she felt in her sternum before she processed it as sound. Then the heavy machine gun opened up from somewhere she hadn't ranged yet, an elevated bunker position on the eastern wall of the canyon, partially masked by a rock overhang that had made it invisible to thermal at this angle. Tracer rounds, greenish-white in the NVG spectrum, hosed across the canyon floor and shredded the right side of Alpha Element's formation. She heard the radio dissolve into overlapping transmissions, 2 or 3 voices cutting each other off, someone calling a casualty, Hale's voice louder than the rest trying to establish order. The machine gun was obvious. Anyone could engage the machine gun. The machine gun was already doing its job, pinning Alpha in the canyon while the sequence charges cut off their retreat. Elena wasn't looking at the machine gun. She was looking at the boulder formation on the north slope. Because now that the ambush had triggered and every mind in that valley was focused on the machine gun and the smoke and the chaos on the canyon floor, whoever was up there would be working, adjusting, directing, calling corrections. She moved her eye to the scope. The crosswind came off the ridge in a gust that shifted the snow sideways across her field of view. She let it register. Noted the direction, the duration, the frequency of the gusts. Started building a wind model in her head. Not a calculated model the way a computer builds one, but the intuitive version, the one that comes from 10,000 hours of doing exactly this in exactly these conditions. 1,338 meters. Heavily massed target. Crosswind variable, approximately 12 to 18 kilometers per hour, shifting in 8 to 12-second cycles. She found the window. Not a literal window. A gap in the rock formation. A shadow line that was slightly wrong because there was something in it that the rock color didn't account for. She held on it. In the canyon below, someone screamed. She breathed out slowly. Let the scope settle. Held the crosshair 2 mils left for deflection, accounting for 1 additional mil of Coriolis at this latitude and elevation. Adjusted her elevation turret 4.2, MRD up from her established 500 meter zero. Pressed her cheek against the stock and felt the familiar pressure of the rifle against her shoulder. The shadow in the gap moved. For approximately 1 heartbeat, it resolved into something recognizable. Elena Cross fired. The suppressor turned the muzzle blast into something that barely registered against the noise of the machine gun and the secondary fires from the canyon. Recoil pushed the rifle back against her shoulder in a controlled, familiar wave, and she cycled the bolt by reflex, automatically chambering the next round without removing her eye from the scope, already recovering the sight picture. Through the scope, at 1,338 meters, she watched the shadow in the gap fall. The machine gun kept firing. She moved her eye left, found the gun position, found the gunner's exposed arm, calculated. The shot was closer, only 600 meters, but the angle was worse, and the gunner was partially behind the rock overhang, and she was going to have approximately 1 second between the moment he shifted to adjust his fire and the moment he moved back behind cover. She waited. In the canyon, Hale's voice on the radio. "Bravo! We have 1 casualty, 1 man pinned behind rockfall. We cannot..." "Say again. We cannot reach the objective." The machine gunner shifted. Elena fired. The heavy weapon went silent mid-burst. The way guns go silent when the gunner stops and not the ammunition. The belt-end silence that has a specific acoustic character anyone who's been in a firefight knows. Silence flooded into this canyon like water. And in that silence, Elena Cross breathed out slowly, held her position, and began scanning for the next threat. Below her, in the broken canyon where smoke still drifted and 2 men were down, and 11 more were processing what had just happened, Captain Marcus Hale keyed his radio with shaking hands. "Bravo," he said. Did you just..." "Kestrel 1, Elena said, her voice exactly as flat and controlled as it had been during the morning brief. "I have the north slope clear. The machine gun position is cold. Recommend Alpha Element move now on the objective before they regroup. You have a window of approximately 4 to 6 minutes. Silence on the net. "Captain," she said, 4 to 6 minutes. 3 seconds passed. Then, "Alpha Element, move. Move now." They moved. 11 men through smoke and broken stone, the canyon floor still hissing where tracer rounds had scorched it, the air tasting of cordite and pulverized rock. Hale pushed them hard, the kind of hard that comes from understanding, suddenly and viscerally, that someone else has just bought you a window you didn't earn, and that window is closing. He didn't look up at the ridgeline. Didn't have time to think about what had just happened up there, or how, or what it meant. He just moved his men forward. Elena tracked them from Bravo position, her eye alternating between the thermal and the scope, running a continuous sector scan across everything the canyon walls could hide. Her breath was controlled, her body pressed flat against the cold stone, the rifle an extension of her shoulder rather than something she was holding. She'd fired twice in the last 4 minutes. She wasn't thinking about either shot. She was already 3 problems ahead, reading the terrain for what the ambush architect would do next if they had reserve elements, if they'd planned for the gun going silent, if there was a secondary trigger somewhere in the rocks she hadn't found yet. Petty Officer First Class Dana Torres, call sign Torch, was the first man to reach the objective compound wall, 26 seconds ahead of the rest of the element, which wasn't ideal but wasn't unexpected. Torres had a pathological inability to pace himself, and Hale had long since stopped trying to correct it. Torres pressed himself against the compound wall, cleared left, cleared right, and keyed his radio. Alpha 1, wall. Compound exterior clear on east face. Hale came in behind him with Reyes and 4 others, the remaining men peeling off into a security perimeter that was ragged at the edges because 2 of them were carrying the casualty, Petty Officer 3rd Class Marcus Webb, who'd taken shrapnel from the first detonation and was ambulatory but not fast and not quiet about it. "How bad?" Hale asked the man beside Webb without stopping. "Through and through, right calf. He's okay. Slow. Get him behind the wall." They stacked on the compound's east entrance, a heavy wooden door reinforced with steel banding, the kind of door that announced money and paranoia without necessarily meaning both. Torres assessed it. Reyes assessed it. They exchanged a look that constituted an entire conversation about breaching options in approximately 2 seconds. "Charge," Reyes said. "It's going to be loud." "It's already been loud." Torres pulled a strip charge from his kit. 60 meters above them, on the canyon wall, Elena found what she'd been looking for. It was small, the displacement of shadow in a crack between 2 rocks, a configuration that should have been uniform at this hour, and wasn't, not quite, because something with mass and body heat was occupying part of it. She held on it, ranged it. 830 meters, angular, slightly above and left of the compound entrance. Whoever it was had a clean angle on the alpha element stack at the door. She keyed her radio. "Kestrel 1, Bravo, I have a secondary observer, east wall. Grid." She read the numbers. "Elevation Delta. He has eyes on your entry stack." Hale came back immediately. "Can you take him?" "Yes." "Do it." She already had the elevation dialed. The wind had dropped in the last 90 seconds. The mountain doing something she'd been watching it do all night, cycling through calm periods between gusts in an irregular but partially predictable pattern. She was in the 3rd second of a calm period. She had maybe 4 seconds left before the next gust. She fired. The secondary observer stopped moving. "Bravo, target down, your entry is clear." "Copy." The strip charge went. The door came apart in a burst of pressure and splinter. Alpha element poured through the gap in a 2-column flow. Torres first, Hale fourth, Reyes pulling security at the breach point. The compound swallowed them. Elena held position, maintained sector scan, noted the time, 0531. Civil twilight in approximately 22 minutes. When the light came, the geometry of the battlefield would change, and not entirely in their favor. She found nothing else. For 7 minutes and 40 seconds, she counted, the radio carried only the compressed, controlled traffic of a CQB clearance. Room calls. Clear calls. The occasional sharp verbal challenge that didn't produce a shot, which meant whoever was inside had made a decision. One sharp exchange, 2 voices, one in a language she didn't recognize. And then Reyes's voice, "Tango down, southeast corner room." Then Torres, "We have the package. I say again, we have the package. She's mobile." Elena let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Not relief exactly. More like the release of a specific type of tension that she'd been carrying since the first detonation, the tension of waiting to find out whether the cost of the next few minutes was going to be worth it. The analyst was alive. The mission was intact. The window she'd opened by dropping the observer and the machine gunner had been enough. She keyed her radio. "Kestrel 1, Bravo, I'm beginning exfil to rally point Kilo on your order." Hale's voice, slightly breathless. "Negative, Bravo. Hold position until we're clear of the compound. I want overwatch on our exfil route." "Copy. Standing by." She settled back in. The cold had gotten into her left knee sometime in the last hour, a deep ache that she noted and set aside. There was a bruise forming along her right cheekbone where the rifle had contacted her face harder than ideal during the second shot, a consequence of the angle and the rush. She noted that too, set it aside. Below her, the compound disgorged alpha element in a careful, deliberate sequence, the kind of controlled exfil that looked almost choreographed because it had been rehearsed enough times that the muscle memory was stronger than the adrenaline. Hale came out last. Old habit, or training, or both. They moved back up the canyon toward the blast zone, which was going to complicate the exfil because 3 of the 5 detonation points had collapsed sections of the trail, and they were going to have to bypass around loose scree in the growing dark. Elena watched them navigate it from above, tracking the thermal signatures, noting when the formation compressed around a difficult section and opened back up when they'd cleared it. She didn't move from Bravo position until the last man in Alpha element cleared the canyon mouth, and she had visual on the casualty collection point 200 meters beyond. Only then did she begin her own exfil. The descent from Bravo position was worse than the ascent. Not because it was more technically demanding, it was about the same, but because she'd been cold and still for 2.5 hours, and the leg muscles that had gone rigid on the rock shelf now had to perform precise movements on frost-slicked stone in diminishing darkness. She took it slow. Slower than she wanted to. 1 anchor point at a time, testing each before weighting it, moving with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what a fall from this height would cost, and was not willing to pay it. She reached the canyon floor at 0614, 41 minutes after beginning her descent, and walked out of the ravine mouth into the gray pre-dawn light to find Alpha element in various states of collapse against the rocks. Men sitting, some lying flat, the particular exhausted stillness of soldiers who have just run their systems hard and are now waiting for the body to file its complaints. Webb was propped against a boulder with his leg elevated and a tourniquet above the knee, which meant the through and through had been messier than first reported. He was conscious, looking at the sky, not talking to anyone. The analyst, a woman, 40-something, brown hair dark with sweat, and something else that might have been blood, though she was moving under her own power, was seated to Webb's left with a thermal blanket around her shoulders, and Torres crouched beside her doing some kind of field assessment. Hale was on the radio. He looked up when Elena came around the boulder, looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, then went back to the radio. Kowalski was there. He saw her first, pushed off the rock he was leaning on, and walked toward her. "You're hurt," he said, looking at her face. "It's a bruise." "You're sure?" "Kowalski." "Right." He fell into step beside her. "That was you. The gun position and the observer. That was you." It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it like one. "Where did you—" He stopped, tried again. 800-meter plus shots. Moving targets. In that crosswind. 1100, the first one. He was quiet for a few steps. 1100. The observer was controlling the gun position. If he stayed up, they'd have reorganized. The gap between taking the observer and taking the gun was maybe 90 seconds. Once the gunner understood the observer was gone, he started exposing himself, looking for new direction. That's when I had a clear angle. Kowalski nodded slowly, like a man absorbing something that required more space than he currently had. "Okay," he said. "How's Webb?" "He'll keep the leg. Medic says it missed the artery by about 2 centimeters. "And the analyst?" "Dehydrated, maybe a cracked rib, some cuts. Mentally, she's holding it together better than you'd expect." He glanced sideways at her. "Then again, I keep meeting women today who are holding it together better than I'd expect." Elena said nothing. "That was a compliment." "I know what it was." Hale finished on the radio and walked toward the group. He moved differently than he had before the mission. Still upright, still controlled, but some of the easy looseness was gone, replaced by something that sat more carefully on him. He stopped in front of Elena. For a moment he said nothing. She waited. "The gun position," he said. "When did you identify it?" "I had a probable location before Alpha entered the canyon. The thermal signature on the north slope was anomalous before the ambush triggered. You called it in. I reported a query. You told me the intel showed that sector clear." He held her gaze. She held his. Neither of them looked away. "How long had you been watching it?" "Approximately 40 minutes. And you were sure enough to, He stopped. "You waited until you had the shot." "I waited until I understood what I was looking at. Once the ambush triggered, the observer's behavior confirmed what the thermal signature suggested." She paused. "I should have pushed harder on the initial report. That's on me." It was the kind of admission that required something back. Hale seemed to understand that, and the understanding appeared to cost him something. "The secondary observer on the east wall," he said. "I didn't even know he was there." "He had a clean angle on your entry stack." "I know." He looked at the canyon wall, at the place where the secondary observer had been, though it was too far and too dark to see anything. If he'd had a weapon and not a radio, he had a weapon. He just wasn't in a position to use it quickly. Hale looked back at her. How do you know? Because if he'd been in position to use it, he would have when the strip charge went. He was shifting when I took the shot. Repositioning. It was a communicator who was trying to become a shooter. 30 more seconds, he would have been. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. Hale wasn't processing new data anymore. He was processing a revised understanding of an existing situation, which was a slower and more uncomfortable thing. Reyes appeared at Hale's shoulder. Extraction is inbound 30 minutes. We need to move to the LZ. Copy. Hale didn't move immediately. He was still looking at Elena. Then, good work, Sergeant. He said it like the words were unfamiliar in his mouth. Not insincere. She'd heard insincere enough times to know the difference. Just uncomfortable. Like putting on a shirt you hadn't worn in a while and finding it fit differently than you remembered. She nodded once. He walked away. Reyes stayed behind for a half second, looking at her. He had a bruise forming on his own jaw. She hadn't noticed it during the mission, from a contact that must have happened during the CQB. He looked at her face, at the rifle, at the north slope, all in about 2 seconds. His expression didn't change. The observer, he said, 1,100 meters. Yes. He looked at the north slope once more. Then he walked away too. The LZ was a flat shelf of mountain meadow 1.5 kilometers from the canyon mouth, accessible via a trail that was only theoretically a trail in the dark. In practice, it was a series of cairns and boot marks from previous transits through this sector, illuminated by headlamps set to red light and navigated by the man in front and the man behind, and the trust that one of them knew where he was going. Hale navigated. Elena was third in line behind Torres, ahead of Callahan. She could hear Webb's breathing behind her, controlled but effortful, his compromised leg producing a gait that didn't match the terrain, each uneven step costing him more than it should. She didn't offer to help. She'd watched Webb's body language for the last 20 minutes and understood that helping would be the wrong move. He was managing. He needed to manage. The analyst, her name was apparently Sarah Decker, though Elena had only heard it spoken once, in a radio exchange she'd been only half listening to, walked between Torres and Reyes with the kind of careful placement of each foot that said she was exhausted and in pain, but had made a private decision to function despite both. Elena had seen that walk before. It was a specific kind of decision that certain people made and certain people didn't, and it had very little to do with training. Callahan walked behind Elena without speaking for the first half kilometer. Then, how far was the first shot? She didn't answer immediately. Let the terrain absorb the question for a moment. 11.3. 1,130 meters? Approximate. I'll confirm with my range card when we're back. In that crosswind. He was quiet for a bit. Then, I saw you standing outside last night before the brief. Just standing there. Yes. What were you doing? She picked her way around a loose section of trail. Listening. To what? The wind. He didn't ask a follow-up, which was the first smart thing she'd seen him do in 24 hours. She revised her assessment of him slightly upward. The trail bent left around a rock formation, and the LZ opened in front of them. A wide, pale space in the pre-dawn gray, the grass still frost-stiff, the air holding a quality of light that wasn't quite dawn but was no longer dark. Hale called the halt, moved to a high point at the LZ's edge, and began talking quietly into his radio. Elena lowered herself to a seat on a flat rock at the perimeter, placed her rifle across her knees, and did something she rarely did in the presence of others. She closed her eyes. Not sleeping, just running a very brief internal inventory of her physical state, the way you check a vehicle before pushing it again. Left knee aching, cheekbone bruised, not broken. She confirmed this by pressing on it carefully, noting the pain was superficial, not structural. Hands were cold, dexterity reduced by maybe 15%, nothing that would affect her ability to maintain the weapon or fire if needed. Back was stiff from the extended prone. Hunger was manageable. Hydration was marginal. She opened her eyes and drank the last of her water. Kowalski dropped down beside her. Not on the rock. There wasn't room. But on the ground next to it, sitting with his knees up, watching the sky get lighter. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask?" "When you took the first shot, the observer on the north slope, you'd been sitting on that position for 40 minutes waiting for a confirm, and then the ambush went hot, and you took the shot in," he thought, "what, 30 seconds?" "About that." "How did you know?" She thought about whether to answer the question and decided on a version of the truth. The observer had a pattern. When the terrain around you is trying to stay still and one part of it isn't quite succeeding, you track that part. He'd moved 4 times in 40 minutes. Small movements, repositioning, probably getting uncomfortable. Each time he moved, I had approximately 1 to 3 seconds of visible target before he settled back into cover. She paused. When the ambush triggered, he had to move. He had to signal the mortar position, which was offset from the gun, different axis. He had to choose between the gun and the mortar. That decision process required him to show himself for longer than he wanted to. Kowalski was quiet. "He was very good," Elena said. "He just didn't account for someone being patient enough to watch him for 40 minutes before the shooting started." "Where do you even learn—" Kowalski caught himself. "Never mind. Stupid question." "No, it's a reasonable question with an answer I'm not going to give you." He laughed, short and genuine. "Fair enough." She looked at the sky. "You play guitar." He blinked at the change of direction. "I'm learning." "You've been playing the same chord progression for 2 days. It's a difficult chord progression. It's G, C, and D." He looked at her. "How do you were barely in the room." "I was in the room enough." He shook his head slowly. "You pay attention to everything." "Most things," she said. "I missed the secondary observer on the east wall for the first pass of the sector scan. Took me 12 minutes to find him. That's too long." "You found him before my guys stacked on the door." "Barely." He seemed about to say something else, but Hale's voice cut across the LZ. "Extraction in 8 minutes. Get Webb set for a litter if he needs it." The group reorganized around the task. Elena stood, checked her rifle, moved to a position at the LZ perimeter where she had angles on the approaches, and resumed observation. Old habit, or discipline, or both. The analyst, Decker, was about 15 meters away, sitting on a supply pack someone had laid on the ground. She was looking at Elena. Not in the way people usually looked at Elena. Not assessment or curiosity or the particular expression she'd been seeing all night, the one that recalibrated without quite admitting it was doing so. Decker was looking at her the way someone looks at a thing they are trying to understand because understanding it matters. Elena looked back. Decker said quietly enough that it didn't carry, "You were up on the ridge." Not a question. "Yes," Elena said. Decker nodded slowly. She looked down at her hands, which were wrapped in someone's extra gloves, too large, the fingers bunching at the knuckles. "I heard the machine gun stop," she said. "I was in the room, and I heard it stop." She looked up again. I knew what that meant. Elena said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would add to it. Decker said, "Thank you." Elena held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the approach. "Don't thank me," she said. "You should have never been in that room." It came out flatter than she intended. Not unkind, but blunt in the way things come out when you haven't slept, and the adrenaline has metabolized into a kind of bare wire honesty. She started to add something, but Decker was nodding again, not hurt, like she'd said the thing that Decker had been thinking herself and hearing it out loud was somehow useful. "No," Decker agreed. "I shouldn't have been." The helicopter came in from the west, low and fast, a heavy twin-rotor that traded discretion for cargo capacity, and wasn't particularly apologetic about either. It flared onto the LZ and the rotor wash went through the group like a cold hand, flattening grass and stripping whatever warmth they'd managed to accumulate in the last 7 minutes. Loading went fast. Webb first, on a collapsible litter, conscious and vocal about it. Decker next. Then the rest of the element, by priority and role. Hale took the last seat and looked back across the LZ before the ramp came up, the way commanders look at the ground that cost them something. With the particular combination of accounting and guilt and relief that comes from knowing the arithmetic of the day, but not yet being fully certain of what it means. Elena was seated against the forward bulkhead, rifle between her knees, eyes forward. The helicopter lifted. She felt the altitude change in her ears, in the pressure behind her sinuses, in the familiar levitation that she'd experienced enough times that it no longer produced any kind of reaction other than mild acknowledgement. The mountains fell away beneath them. The black ravine valley became a thin, dark line in the growing light, then a shadow, then a wrinkle in the terrain indistinguishable from any other. Somewhere in the transition, she became aware that Reyes was watching her. He was seated across the cargo bay, 4 meters away, his eyes steady over the rattle and noise of the aircraft. Not aggressive, not curious exactly, just watching, the way a man watches something that has revised a conclusion he'd thought was settled. He'd been doing this, she realized, since they'd X-filed the compound. Not constantly, but in the quiet moments, in the spaces between tasks. She met his gaze. He didn't look away. He nodded, once. A very small movement. She understood it wasn't an apology. Men like Reyes didn't apologize with gestures. But it was an acknowledgement of a specific kind, the kind that cost something to give, and that she knew, from experience, was rarer and more meaningful than most of what people said with actual words. She looked back at the middle distance. The helicopter turned north and the sun came over the eastern ridge, pale and cold and indifferent, laying a flat yellow light across the mountains that made them look briefly like something from a painting. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they've just tried to kill you and failed. Elena pulled her kit tighter, closed her eyes, and slept. She slept with the rifle between her knees, her right hand resting on the receiver, exactly as she slept everywhere, in every vehicle, on every aircraft, in every dark room she'd been assigned to in the last 9 years. She slept the way she did everything, completely, without apology, and in a manner that told you nothing at all about who she actually was or where she had actually been. The helicopter flew north. Back at Iron Ridge, a sealed dossier was waiting on the desk of the base's command sergeant major. He'd received it 40 minutes ago by secure courier with a classification header that had made him sit down before he opened it. He'd read it once, quickly, then again, slowly. Then he'd closed it and sat in his chair for a while, looking at the far wall. He was still sitting there when the distant thump of rotor blades announced that Alpha Element was inbound. He picked up the dossier, stood, and walked toward the landing pad. The landing pad at Iron Ridge was a rectangle of painted steel plate bolted to a concrete pad, and Command Sergeant Major Nathan Briggs was standing on it when the helicopter touched down. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been very large and had compressed over the decades into something denser and quieter. Gray hair cut to regulation, a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete sometime in his 30s and had never quite relaxed since. He wore no hat despite the rotor wash, which said something about either his ego or his indifference to discomfort, and the sealed dossier in his left hand was pressed flat against his thigh as though he'd forgotten it was there. He hadn't forgotten it. He watched the ramp come down, watched the element file out, Webb on the litter, Decker in the thermal blanket, the rest in the shuffling, heavy-footed formation of men who've expended most of what they had. He tracked each face without obvious effort, reading them the way you read terrain, for information, not for connection. His gaze stopped on Elena when she came off the ramp, fourth out, rifle slung, kit still fully rigged. It stopped there and stayed. She noticed him immediately, not because he was standing on the landing pad, though that was unusual enough, but because of the dossier and the way he was holding it, and the classification header visible on the outer cover even at 30 meters in bad light. She recognized the header. Her expression didn't change. She kept walking. Briggs watched her walk past without moving, then turned and followed the group toward the operations hut. Hale was running on fumes and stubbornness, which was his natural operating state, and had been for as long as anyone in the platoon had known him. He'd grabbed a coffee somewhere between the landing pad and the ops hut. No one saw him get it, it just appeared in his hand, and he was standing at the TOC board marking the mission complete when Briggs came through the door. The room noticed. Not loudly. Nobody called attention. Nobody snapped to. But the quality of movement changed. Conversations shortened. Men who'd been sprawled against walls sat up slightly. Briggs had that effect in spaces the way certain objects displace the air around them just by existing. "Captain Hale," Briggs said. "Sergeant Major." Hale turned. He'd met Briggs twice before, both times at command-level briefings, and had come away from both encounters with the impression of a man who said, approximately 40% of what he was thinking, and used the other 60% as a kind of structural load-bearing element. I wasn't expecting you at Iron Ridge. No, Briggs agreed. He looked at the room, looked at Elena, who was at the far end removing her kit in the systematic, unhurried way she did everything. I need the room for a few minutes, Captain. Hale looked at him. We're in the middle of a post-mission. I know what you're in the middle of. Briggs's voice didn't change volume or inflection. It didn't need to. A few minutes. The room cleared faster than it needed to. Reyes went last, pausing at the door for a half-second, reading the situation with the professional assessment of a man who'd spent 16 years learning to identify the moments when the thing happening was bigger than the room it was happening in. He went through the door. It closed. Hale, Briggs, and Elena. Briggs and Hale looked between them. What's this about? Briggs didn't answer Hale. He walked to Elena and stopped in front of her with a directness that wasn't rude but was completely without the social choreography that usually softened that kind of thing. Sergeant Cross, he said. Sergeant Major. I'd like to examine your weapon, if you're willing. The phrasing was precise enough that Hale caught it. If you're willing, not hand it over, not let me see that. A request, not an order. He looked at Elena, waiting for her to be confused or thrown by the specificity of it. She wasn't. She unslung the rifle and handed it to Briggs with both hands, muzzle down. He took it the same way. He turned it slowly. Not examining the mechanics, he went past the action, past the optic, and turned the weapon so the underside of the receiver faced him. He tilted it slightly toward the light from the overhead fixture. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he nodded, once, and handed the rifle back. Captain Hale, he said, still looking at Elena, I'm going to tell you something. I'm telling you as a courtesy, not as a requirement. You can take it however you need to. Hale set his coffee down. Go ahead. The weapon your attachment carried into Black Ravine tonight was built by a program called Project Eclipse. It's classified above your current access level, so I'm going to give you the minimum relevant context and nothing more. He paused. Project Eclipse is a strategic precision program, not a unit, a program. It selects candidates from across the services, runs them through a training pipeline that takes somewhere between 3 and 5 years depending on the individual, and produces what the program's founding documentation describes as strategic-level marksmen. Operators capable of precision engagement at distances and under conditions that conventional sniper employment doctrine considers outside the realm of reliable effect. The room was very quiet. Hale said carefully, How many graduates? That information is classified. How many deployed? Also classified. Briggs looked at him now. What I can tell you is that the weapon Sergeant Cross carries was built for her specifically. Not assigned to her, built for her, after her program graduation, as a function of the specific physical and technical parameters she demonstrated across the training cycle. He looked back at Elena. The etching beneath the receiver is the program's identification mark. Every graduated weapon has one. There are very few of them. Elena was looking at a point on the wall approximately 18 inches above Briggs's head. Her face was doing nothing. The mission report, Hale said. His voice had changed. Not in volume, not in control, but in something harder to name, some quality of weight that hadn't been there before. The engagement distances. I saw the preliminary radio traffic, Briggs said. 1,100 plus meters on the first shot, under active crosswind, during an ambush event. He said it as simple fact, the way you describe weather. And I'm telling you that Sergeant Cross's service record, the portions of it that exist above your access level, contains 4 operational deployments in 3 different theaters that I am not able to discuss in specifics. He paused. I will say that 2 of the engagements in that record are cited in program literature as reference cases for what is achievable under field conditions. They're used to set the upper boundary of what the program trains toward. Hale stood very still. She's not the most decorated graduate, Briggs said, with the clinical precision of a man reading from something he'd memorized. She's the most precise. There's a distinction, and it matters. He looked at Elena again. The program's terminology for that distinction is consistency under degraded conditions. Anyone can make a difficult shot once. The program's interest is in operators who make difficult shots when they're cold and injured and have been awake for 30 hours and the wind is doing something the model didn't predict. Something in the room shifted. Not loudly. No one moved, no one spoke, But the geometry of it changed, the way a room changes when the center of gravity has relocated, and everyone present is recalibrating without quite admitting they're doing it. Hale looked at Elena. Why didn't you? He stopped. Your jacket, the version I was given. It listed 2 deployments. I know what it listed, Elena said. That's not... He pulled back, tried again. I made assignment decisions based on... I know, she said. Most people do. The flatness in her voice wasn't aimed at him. That was the thing he was working to understand in real time. It wasn't directed. It wasn't a weapon being used. It was just the tone of someone stating a fact about a pattern they'd observed across a long time and had largely stopped being surprised by. Hale put his hands on the TOC table. He was looking at the surface of it, not at either of them. His coffee sat beside his right hand, going cold. Briggs let the silence do its work for a moment. Then he looked at Elena and said, The program is aware of tonight's operation. The citation process will proceed through appropriate channels. I'd rather it didn't, she said. I know. Sergeant Major, I know Sergeant Cross. He said it with a firmness that was also something close to kindness, the kind that doesn't negotiate but does, at least, acknowledge. It's not my decision, and it's not yours. The program has documentation requirements. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. You did your job. You're allowed to let the record reflect that. She said nothing. He nodded once, picked up the dossier from where he'd set it on the edge of the table, and walked to the door. He paused there with his hand on the frame. Captain Hale, he said, without turning around. Sergeant Major. The position she occupied on the North Slope. Bravo Overwatch. Yes. That position was on no map produced for this operation. It was not in the patrol order. It was not in the original planning product. He finally turned, just enough to be seen in partial profile. She identified it, assessed it, and occupied it on her own initiative, based on her own terrain analysis, before the mission began. He looked at Hale. I want you to think about what would have happened in Black Ravine tonight if that position had been empty. He went through the door. It closed. Hale didn't move for what felt like a long time. Elena picked up her rifle, slung it, and started toward the side exit. Cross. She stopped. I put you at Bravo because I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought it was the position where you do the least damage if something went wrong. I know. That was... He pressed his mouth closed. Opened it. That was bad judgment. It was the judgment you had, she said. It's what you do with the next one that matters. She went through the door. Cham. The base ran at low frequency for the next 2 hours. The specific quiet of a place processing something that required time to metabolize. Men moved through their post-mission tasks with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. But conversations were shorter than usual, and there were more of them happening in pairs, in corners, at the edge of the landing pad where the wind carried words away before they could settle into record. Callahan cleaned his weapon at the equipment table and didn't speak for 40 minutes. When Kowalski sat down across from him and started disassembling his own sidearm, Callahan looked up. Project Eclipse, he said. Yeah. You'd heard of it. Kowalski ran a brush through the barrel of his pistol. Rumors. The community has, you know how it is. There are things that get talked about in the same way that things that might not be real get talked about. Late night, after a few beers, someone knows a guy who said something about a program. What kind of rumors? Kowalski set the barrel down. The kind where someone at a range qualifies at a distance that doesn't make sense, and then the score gets classified and the person never mentions it again. He picked up the barrel again. That kind. Callahan was quiet. I asked her what she was doing outside last night, before the brief. She said she was listening to the wind. Yeah. I thought she was... I don't know what I thought. Most of us thought the same thing. No, you didn't. You were curious about her. Kowalski considered this. I was curious because she didn't react to Hale the way people react to Hale. He does this thing where he establishes the hierarchy in the first 30 seconds, and most people adjust to it without even knowing they're doing it. She just didn't. Like it wasn't relevant information. He paused. That's either a sign that someone is very out of their depth or very far past caring about the things that make depth feel relevant. Which one did you think it was? Honestly, I wasn't sure, but I thought the rifle was interesting. Because she slept with it. Because of the way she slept with it. There's a difference. He assembled his pistol in 4 clean movements. She wasn't gripping it. Most people who sleep with a weapon, and there are more of them than you'd think, there's something possessive in it. She just had it beside her, like you'd lay out your kit the night before a movement, just placing it where it needed to be. Callahan thought about this. Is that what 1100 meters looks like from the other end? Someone who just places the thing where it needs to be. Kowalski holstered the pistol. I think so, he said. I think that's exactly what it looks like. Reyes found Hale in the planning room 30 minutes after Briggs left. Hale was standing at the window, a narrow rectangle of reinforced glass that looked out onto the mountain slope, the same mountains that had housed Black Ravine that were sitting there now in the early morning light, looking exactly as they had before the mission and nothing like the version of themselves that had existed between 0453 and 0609. Mountains were like that. They absorbed everything and showed nothing. Reyes didn't announce himself. He came in, saw where Hale was, and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. They'd served together for 6 years. There were things between them that didn't require words and things that did, and they'd generally gotten good at knowing which was which. You knew, Hale said. Not an accusation. Reyes was quiet for a moment. I suspected something. When? When she asked about the lateral distance to Alpha position. The question wasn't about her own safety. It was about coverage geometry. She was thinking about what she could support and from where before the mission started. He paused. Then when she reported the anomaly on the north slope, the way she described it, not, I think I see something, not, there might be movement. She said, anomalous thermal signature. That's program language. You know program language. I know a lot of things from a lot of places. He left that there. I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain and because it wasn't my place. If you'd said something, what would you have done differently? Hale turned from the window, looked at him. Would you have put her on Alpha? Reyes said. At 0200, with no access to her full record based on me saying I had a feeling about her, you'd have told me to get some sleep. He uncrossed his arms. The outcome tonight was good, Marcus. Webb's keeping his leg. Decker's alive. The target compound is cleared. That's the outcome. 6 hours ago, I told Callahan she probably had attachment issues. Reyes didn't respond to that immediately. He walked to the window and stood beside Hale, and they both looked at the mountains. You know what the worst part is? Hale said. Tell me. She said, when I told her the intel showed the north slope clear, she said understood. And then she went back to watching it anyway. His jaw tightened. She didn't argue, didn't push. She just noted my response and kept doing the correct thing anyway, because she was sure. Because she was sure and she understood that I wasn't going to listen, and she worked around it. Yeah, that's not... He stopped. That's not how a team operates. That's what happens when someone doesn't trust the team to function. Maybe, Reyes said, or maybe that's what happens when someone has been in enough situations where the team didn't function, and she had to be the part that did. Hale looked at the mountains for a while. I'm going to need to apologize to her. Probably. She's not going to make it easy. No, Reyes agreed. I don't think she's interested in making things easy. Elena was at the armory bench when Decker found her. The armory was a narrow room attached to the equipment hut, lit by 2 fluorescents, smelling of CLP and carbon fouling. Elena had been there for 45 minutes, performing a full post-mission breakdown and cleaning of the rifle. Not a quick function check, a complete teardown. She was on the scope rings, checking torque on each screw with a small wrench, when the door opened. Decker still had the thermal blanket around her shoulders. She'd been checked out by the medic, nothing broken, lacerations on her left arm and shoulder from something in the compound, and she'd been told to sleep, which she clearly hadn't done. You have a minute? Decker said. Elena tightened the last scope ring screw and set the wrench down. Yes. Decker came in and sat on the bench across the room, pulling the thermal blanket tighter. She looked at the rifle the way someone looks at a thing that they know means more than they fully understand. How long were you watching the canyon before the mission? I arrived at Bravo at EO 321. Alpha element entered the canyon at EO 453. So almost an hour and a half. Yes. Alone. In the dark. That cold. Yes. Decker processed this. The machine gun. When it went quiet, she stopped, looked at her hands. I was in the back room of the compound. I could hear everything through the walls, the detonations, the gun, the radio. They didn't try to keep the radio quiet. They knew I couldn't do anything. I heard enough. She looked up. The gun went quiet in the middle of a burst, mid-burst. Not at a pause, not at an end, mid-burst, and then nothing. Elena waited. I knew exactly what that meant, Decker said. I've been in the field long enough to know what it means when a gun stops like that. She looked at Elena. I just didn't know who. I didn't even know there was a sniper on our side. The men who took me out, they didn't mention you. I'm not sure they knew you existed. That's generally how it works. Decker was quiet for a moment. How do you do that? The waiting. The stillness. Almost an hour and a half in that cold, alone, before anything happens. Elena considered the question. It was sincere, not rhetorical, not performative. Decker was an intelligence professional who had just spent an indeterminate number of days in a room waiting to find out if anyone was coming, and she was asking the question from that place. You stop fighting the waiting, Elena said. Most people treat waiting as dead time, time between the things that matter. I treat it as the thing that matters. Everything I do before the shot is the work. The shot is just how the work ends. Decker looked at her. That's a very unusual way to think about it. Most of the people who trained me were unusual. Decker almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to a smile, but it got close. Can I ask you something else? You can ask. The first shot, the observer on the north slope. When you took it, were you certain? Elena was quiet for a count of 3. Certain enough. What does that mean? It means I'd watched him long enough to understand his behavior pattern, his position, and his role. Certain enough means the probability of error was within acceptable parameters given the cost of not acting. She paused. There's no such thing as certain. There's assessed, and there's willing to act on the assessment. Decker nodded slowly. I've been doing intelligence work for 14 years, she said, and that is the most accurate description of operational decision-making I've ever heard from someone who isn't an analyst. I've made decisions with bad information, Elena said. You learn what certain actually means when the alternative is available. Decker looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood, pulling the blanket around her, and looked at the rifle. That thing, she said. The sergeant major, I heard some of what he said through the wall, about the program. Elena said nothing. Is it? Decker stopped, chose her words. Is it what he said, the program? Is it what it sounds like? Yes. How long? Long enough. Decker looked at her. And nobody knows. A few people know, the people who need to. And everyone else just forms their own conclusions, Elena said, based on available information. Decker made a sound that might have been a laugh if there had been more room for it. Like sleeping with your rifle. Like sleeping with my rifle. A brief actual smile this time. I'm sorry, Decker said, for what that costs you, the assumptions people make. Elena picked up the wrench again and returned to the scope rings. It costs less than the alternative, she said. The alternative is people knowing and behaving differently because they know. I've seen what that looks like. I prefer this. Decker looked at her for a moment longer. Then she went to the door. Get some sleep, Sergeant Cross. You too. Decker went out, and the door closed, and Elena finished the scope rings in silence and went on to the bolt face, the same systematic attention she'd applied to every component, neither faster nor slower than any other night. Outside, the morning was fully established, cold, pale, the kind of light that made everything look recent and provisional. Operators moved between buildings. Webb was visible through the window of the medical hut, sitting up on the treatment table, talking to someone. The mountains sat where they'd always sat, indifferent and enormous. Inside the armory, Elena reassembled the rifle, verified function, and placed it on the bench beside her. She sat looking at it for a moment. Not with sentiment, not with the particular regard that people who didn't understand would misinterpret as obsession. Just looking, the way you look at a tool that has done what it was built to do, that has been maintained and will be maintained, that asks nothing and performs everything and has never once in 9 years given her a reason to doubt it. She picked it up, carried it to the bunk room, set it on the mattress beside her, lay down. She was asleep in 4 minutes. At the operations hut, Hale was writing the after-action report. He'd been writing it for 20 minutes and had produced exactly one complete sentence, because the second sentence required him to answer a question he wasn't sure how to answer yet, the question of what had actually happened in Black Ravine, as opposed to what the radio traffic would suggest had happened. He deleted the sentence, stared at the blank page. Then he wrote it again, differently this time, beginning not with the element composition or the movement plan or the weather conditions, but with a single line that he wrote slowly and with more care than he usually applied to administrative products. This report must note at the outset that the successful resolution of Operation Frozen Talon was due in decisive measure to the performance of one operator whose assignment to this element I did not fully understand at the time, and whose capabilities I failed to adequately assess before the operation began. He read it back, thought about deleting it, left it. Somewhere across the base, in a room he couldn't see, the woman he'd laughed at yesterday was sleeping with her rifle. He went back to writing. Hale finished the after-action report at 0847 hours. It ran 14 pages, which was 4 pages longer than his standard product and 3 pages longer than Theater Command's template allowed for. He didn't shorten it. He printed 2 copies, put one in the secure document pouch for theater, kept the other, and sat at the desk for a while looking at the wall. Then he went to find Briggs. The command sergeant major had taken the small conference room at the back of the operations hut, a room barely large enough for a table and 4 chairs, with a whiteboard on one wall that still had grid references from a previous unit's planning session chalked across it in fading red. Briggs was on a secure laptop when Hale knocked, looked up, and closed the screen without hurrying. "Captain, I need to understand something," Hale said. "Sit down." Hale sat. He put the after-action report on the table between them. Briggs didn't look at it. "The assignment," Hale said. "Who authorized it?" "The specific decision to attach Cross to my element for this operation. That came from above your level or at your level." "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. Because if it came from above your level, then someone knew exactly what was going into that valley and made a decision not to inform me of what I was working with. And if it came from your level, it came from the program," Briggs said. "Cross was between assignments. The operation was active. The program identified a fit and made the attachment through the appropriate channels, which in this case routed through my office. And the sanitized jacket. Standard program procedure. Graduates don't carry their full operational history in a transferable record. Too many entries above access thresholds. What you received was the unclassified summary, 2 deployments, no visible citations, no red flags. Which makes her look like a junior operator with limited experience. Which makes her look like what she needs to look like," Briggs said, "to operate in environments where she might be compromised, captured, or working alongside personnel without appropriate clearance levels." Hale was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me the cover is intentional. I'm telling you the minimized record is a security measure, not a clerical error. And the operational commanders who receive her are briefed at the level their clearance allows." Briggs looked at him steadily. "Your clearance allowed a 2-deployment summary, Captain. That's what you received. You made decisions based on the available information. I made bad decisions based on available information. That's different from making decisions based on insufficient information through no fault of your own, is it?" Hale put his hand on the after-action report. "Because from where I'm sitting, the distinction is academic. I put her 800 meters from the action in a position I selected because I thought she'd be least likely to cause problems. And she saved my platoon from an isolated position by herself, at distances I didn't think were operationally achievable in those conditions." He stopped. "If she hadn't been who she is, Briggs, if she'd been exactly what her jacket said she was, my platoon would have been destroyed in that canyon. But she is who she is. That's not a system I can trust," Hale said. "A system where my people's survival depends on the attachment being more than their paperwork says." Briggs absorbed this. He was quiet long enough that Hale started to wonder if the conversation was over. Then, "You're not wrong. There are legitimate criticisms of the program's attachment protocol. I've made some of them myself, to people above my pay grade, over the course of several years." He looked at the report. "Write that in your after-action." "I did." Briggs looked at him then. "Read me the relevant section." Hale picked up the report, found the page. The operational commander was not provided sufficient context regarding the capabilities of attached personnel to make fully informed employment decisions. This information gap, while procedurally compliant with classification protocols, created a condition in which the attached specialist was underutilized during the planning phase and misemployed during the initial assignment phase. It is the recommendation of this element's commander that attachment protocols for Project Eclipse personnel include a classified supplemental brief at the receiving commander's clearance ceiling, regardless of whether that ceiling encompasses the full extent of the attached operator's record. He set the report down. Briggs was quiet for a moment. That's going to generate a response from the program. Good. It may not be a favorable response. I'm not looking for favorable, Hale said. I'm looking for different. Briggs nodded slowly, the motion of a man recalibrating someone he'd already calibrated once. He looked at the whiteboard, at the grid references from whatever operation had preceded this one, conducted by men who were already somewhere else, probably facing a different version of the same set of problems. She doesn't want the citation, he said. I know. She never does. Not one of her citations has been received without... He stopped himself at the edge of what he was cleared to say. She has a relationship with recognition that is consistent with her broader relationship with visibility. She doesn't want it. Why? Because visibility is a liability in her line of work. Every operational record that becomes real, that gets attached to her name, that enters a system someone can access, is a thread someone can pull. He paused. She's been operational for 9 years. The operational security discipline required to maintain that kind of profile for 9 years is not incidental. It's structural. It's the reason she functions the way she functions. Hale thought about that. Thought about the woman who had arrived at his base 17 hours ago with a duffel bag and a hardshell case and had said approximately 40 words before the mission brief, who had slept with her rifle and stood in the dark listening to the wind and asked precisely the right questions and received precisely the wrong answers and gone out alone into the mountain dark anyway. She said something to me, Hale said, after Briggs, after you left the ops hut. I told her my judgment had been bad and she said it was the judgment I had and that what mattered was what I did with the next one. Briggs said nothing. That's a very generous thing to say to someone who called you a liability 12 hours earlier. Cross is not ungenerous, Briggs said carefully. She's just selective about where she applies it. The formal debrief was scheduled for 1100 hours and ran long. Theater Command had patched in via secure video 2 senior officers and an intelligence liaison whose name Elena didn't recognize and whose affect suggested someone who processed everything through a filter of institutional skepticism. The debrief followed standard format: chronological account of the operation, decision points, contacts, outcomes, intelligence value of the recovered analyst, Webb's casualty report, Decker's preliminary debriefing, which had already been conducted separately before the full session. Elena sat at the far end of the table. Hale sat at the head. Reyes and Torres flanked him. Kowalski and Callahan were against the wall with 4 others, present for completeness, speaking when addressed. When the debrief reached the contact phase, the intelligence liaison on the video feed leaned forward. His name, according to the tent card in front of his camera, was Farrell. The Overwatch element, Farrell said. Can you describe the specific engagements? Yes, Elena said. She described them. She used the same language she'd use in a range report: distances, wind conditions, target identification, round count, confirmation of effect. She described the decision process on the first shot with the same spare precision she'd used with Decker in the armory, minus the reflective element, because this wasn't a reflection, it was a record. When she finished, Farrell looked at her. You reported an anomaly at the north slope position to the element commander before the ambush triggered. Yes. At what time? She gave the time. And the response was... Farrell looked at a paper in front of him. Intel shows that sector clear. Don't clog the net. That's accurate. Farrell looked at Hale. Hale met his gaze. Neither of them said anything. After that response, Farrell continued, looking back at Elena, you maintained observation on the position you'd identified. Yes. Why? Because my assessment hadn't changed. Even though you'd been told the sector was clear. The sector was not clear. I had a thermal anomaly that indicated otherwise. Being told the sector was clear didn't change what I was observing. She paused. I reported it and received a response. The response didn't change the data. I continued monitoring the data. Farrell wrote something. And when the ambush triggered, I had the shot within 31 seconds. He looked up. 31 seconds from ambush trigger to engagement. Yes. At 1138 meters. My range card puts it at 1114. The 38 is the rangefinder value. There's a calibration variance I've been running since my last depot maintenance. Farrell put his pen down. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way that people look at things they aren't certain are real. Sergeant Cross, your record as provided to this debrief panel lists 2 deployments and no cited engagements. Yes. Is that record accurate? It's the record that was provided to this panel. The room was very quiet. On the video feed, one of the senior officers shifted in his seat. Sergeant Cross, Farrell said carefully, are you the same Sergeant Cross listed as the primary operator in a classified engagement report from... He stopped, looked at something off screen. I'm not going to read the theater designation into this record. No, she agreed, but you're aware of the report I'm referring to. I'm aware of reports that may or may not correspond to what you're describing. That's a... He stopped himself. Are you able to speak to your operational background at any level above what's provided in your transfer record? No. Is there a classification authority in this session at the level required to... No, said Briggs, from his seat against the wall where he'd been silent for 40 minutes. Everyone looked at him. There is not. Farrell looked at Briggs. Sergeant Major, can you confirm... I can confirm that this session's classification ceiling does not permit the discussion of the relevant program or the operator's full record. I can also confirm that a supplemental package will be provided to the appropriate personnel through appropriate channels after this session concludes. He paused. I'd recommend we continue the debrief within its authorized scope. The session continued. But something had changed in the room, the way things change when a question gets asked, and the answer isn't the problem. The fact that the question had to be asked is the problem, and everyone present understood that, and now they were sitting with it. Torres, who had not said more than 20 words during the entire debrief, leaned slightly toward Reyes and said, barely below his breath, she held us together from 1100 meters with a rifle she built herself, and her name isn't even in the system. Reyes didn't respond. He didn't need to. The debrief ended at 12:47. Lunch happened in the fractured, informal way that meals happened at Iron Ridge. People moved through the food service point at different times, sat in different configurations, rarely all at once. Elena ate at the equipment bench in the armory again, not because she was avoiding the common area, but because she had a list of maintenance tasks she wanted to complete before the afternoon, and eating somewhere else would have cost her the time. She was reassembling the bipod when Callahan appeared at the armory door. He stood there for a moment, like a man who has rehearsed something and is now uncertain whether the rehearsal covered the actual situation. He was holding a coffee mug, not his, by the size of it, something borrowed from the food service point. Can I come in? He said. Elena looked at the bipod. It's not my armory. He came in. Set the extra mug on the bench near her, not directly in front of her, off to the side where it could be ignored without drama. She noted this, drank from her own mug without acknowledging the gesture, which was its own form of acknowledgement. I owe you an apology, he said. No, you don't. I laughed when Captain Hale made about the rifle. I laughed. You responded to a social cue from someone with authority over you. That's not a character failing, it's a reflex. He looked at his boots. It felt like a character failing at 0500 hours when I heard the machine gun stop mid-burst. Elena tightened the bipod's rear leg. Did it change how you moved after the gun went cold? What? Did it change your performance during the exfil? Did feeling bad about it make you slower, less effective? He thought. No. Then process it on your own time. The mission's done. She looked at him briefly. You did your job, Callahan. You held your sector. You moved when you were told to move. You carried your end of web on the trail when he needed it. That's the job. He was quiet for a moment. You saw that. I see everything I can see from where I'm positioned. He stopped. That's kind of unsettling. Good, she said. It should be. That's what Overwatch means. He almost laughed, caught it somewhere in his throat before it became fully airborne. Why do you do it the way you do? The sleeping with the rifle, the standing in the dark, He gestured vaguely at the entirety of her. The way you are about everything. Elena was quiet for a moment. She set the bipod down and looked at it. When I was in the program, she said, there was an instructor, old guy. He'd been doing precision work since before most of us were born. He had this thing he used to say, every missed shot has a cause, and the cause was present before the trigger was pressed. She paused. What he meant was, the shot doesn't happen in isolation. It's the product of everything that came before it. Your rest, your preparation, your gear state, your wind reading, your range, your position, your breathing, your decision. Every one of those has to be right. Any one of them being wrong introduces error. And sleeping with the rifle is one of the things that has to be right. She picked up the bipod again. I know exactly what state my weapon is in at all times because I never let it out of my control. I know the precise torque on every scope ring. I know the bore isn't fouled and the bolt face is clean because I cleaned it 6 hours ago. I know the bipod deployment is smooth because I just tested it. She looked at him. When I'm in position and I have one shot and I'm cold and tired and the wind is wrong and the target is barely there and I need to trust that the tool in my hands will do exactly what I ask of it, I trust it because I've earned that trust, every day, every night, without exception. Callahan sat with this for a moment. And the standing in the dark. Wind has memory, she said. Not literally, but a mountain range will tell you what it's going to do before dawn if you pay attention to what it does after midnight. The temperature gradient, the cycle intervals between gusts, the direction shift at different elevations, it runs in patterns. Not perfectly, but enough. If you know the pattern, you can build a model. If you have a model, you're not guessing. You built a wind model for Black Ravine at 1 in the morning. I refined one. I'd started building it from the imagery and the topographic data 2 days before the operation. He looked at her. You knew about this operation 2 days ago. I knew I was being attached to a unit conducting a canyon floor assault in a mountain environment. That's enough to start the work. He shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, more like a man recalibrating the size of something he'd been holding in his hands and finding it heavier than he thought. I want to be better at my job, he said. I say that all the time to myself, when I'm in the gym or on the range or whatever, but I don't... He stopped. I don't know if I want it the way you want it. That's honest, she said. That's actually good. It doesn't feel good. It's better than lying to yourself. She tightened the last bipod fitting. Find the version of it you do want. The version that lives in your actual life, not in the version of yourself you think you're supposed to be. That's where the work is sustainable. He picked up the mug he'd brought and drank from it, looking at the rifle. Did anyone ever tell you that you're not what they expected? Regularly. Did it bother you? In the beginning. She stood, placed the rifle on the rack, and began wiping down the bench. Then I understood that what people expect is mostly about them. What I am is about me. The two don't need to align. He nodded, stood. Thank you, he said, for... He gestured vaguely again, encompassing apparently the armory and the canyon and the last 18 hours and everything she'd said in the last 6 minutes. Thank you for the coffee, she said. He went out. The coffee Callahan had left sat on the bench after he'd gone, still half full, going cold in the way that things go cold at altitude, faster than you expect, like the air is actively reclaiming the warmth you introduced into it. Elena looked at it for a moment, then drank the rest of it standing up before beginning the final inventory of her kit. She had a flight out of Iron Ridge in 36 hours, not back to any installation she'd been to before. A different sector, a different assignment, another envelope pushed through appropriate channels with her name on the outside, and a set of coordinates on the inside and the implicit understanding that she would arrive, assess, and do whatever the situation required. That was the nature of the program's employment cycle. You finished one thing, and there was already another thing. The gap between them was administrative rather than experiential, a matter of paperwork and transit time rather than genuine rest. She'd made peace with that somewhere around year 4, or she'd decided to describe it as peace, which was close enough to the same thing that the distinction had stopped mattering. She was cataloging her optics case when the door opened and Hale came in. He didn't have coffee this time. He came in and stood near the door for a moment, hands at his sides, in the posture of a man who has rehearsed less than he thought he needed to and is now working without the net. You're packing out, he said, 36 hours. I have a movement order. I know, Briggs told me. He looked at the hard shell case, at the rifle in it, at the custom foam nest that had been shaped specifically to the weapon's contours by someone who understood that the weapon and the person were in some sense the same object. I read your program file this afternoon, the supplemental package Briggs cleared for my level. Elena continued packing the optics case. Okay. The Kandahar engagement, 41 months ago. She said nothing. That was you. She placed the lens cloth in the case and closed it. If it's in the supplemental package, then you know the answer. 2,200 meters, he said. Moving target. Vehicle mounted, partial obscuration, 18-knot crosswind, one shot. The vehicle was stopped at the time of the shot. It was moving before and after. He stopped. That's not the point I'm making. I know. She picked up the optics case and set it beside the hard shell. What point are you making, Captain? He came further into the room. Not all the way. He stopped near the bench, putting the workspace between them in a way that might have been deliberate or might have just been where he ended up. I owe you more than what I said earlier. I told you your judgment was bad, and what mattered was the next one. And it was a fair thing to say as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Elena looked at him, waited. I made jokes about you, he said, in front of my men, in front of people who looked to me to set the standard for how this platoon treats people. He said it plainly, without the hedging that people usually employed when admitting things they found uncomfortable. I did that before I had any meaningful information about you, based on one observation that I decided meant something that it didn't mean. And the fact that I didn't have full access to your record doesn't excuse the behavior. It explains a mistake in judgment. It doesn't explain why the mistake looked the way it did. The room was quiet. Outside, someone was running a generator test, a low industrial throb that vibrated the floor slightly and then stopped. You're apologizing, Elena said. Yes. You already apologized. I apologized for the assignment decision. I'm apologizing for something different now. He looked at her directly. For the joke. For the laugh. For treating you like a problem that had been handed to me rather than a person who'd been assigned to work alongside me. Elena held his gaze. Were you wrong about me being a problem? Based on available information. Forget available information, based on what you saw in the first 12 hours. Was I difficult to work with? Did I resist direction, create friction in the team, fail to communicate? He thought. No. I showed up, did my pre-mission prep, attended your briefs, asked questions you didn't have answers for, and then went where you sent me and did what I went there to do. She picked up the hard shell case. You're apologizing for a laugh, Captain. I understand that it matters to you. It doesn't particularly matter to me. Why not? She set the case down. Because I've spent 9 years in environments where people form incorrect conclusions about my capabilities and then update those conclusions when the evidence requires it. What you did in the first 12 hours is what people do. What you did in the after-action report, she stopped. You read it. Briggs showed me the relevant section. He said I had the right to see it. She looked at the rifle. That's what matters. Not the laugh. The report. She looked back at him. You wrote something that was uncomfortable to write and that will likely create friction with people above your pay grade. You wrote it because it was true and because it might produce a better outcome for the next operator who comes through your door with a sanitized jacket and a classified history. She paused. That's the decision that's hard to make. The apology is easy by comparison. Hale was quiet for a moment. Something in his face did a complicated thing. Not quite gratitude, not quite relief, more like the expression of a man who has handed something heavy to someone and found that the person took it without making a ceremony of it. Can I ask you something? He said. You've been asking me things for 2 days. One more. She waited. Do you... He stopped, tried again. Is it worth it? The way you live this? The classified record, the sanitized jacket, the assignments where nobody knows what you are and you can't tell them. The sleeping with the rifle in a room full of people who think it's funny. He shook his head slightly. Is it worth it? The question hung in the armory air for a long moment. Elena looked at the rifle. I don't spend a lot of time on that question, she said. Why not? Because the alternative to asking, is it worth it, is doing the work. And the work is what I'm good at. And being good at something that matters, she paused. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Hale nodded. It was the nod of a man who understood the answer and would need some time to fully inhabit the understanding. He picked up the empty coffee mug from the bench, Callahan's mug, which was still sitting there, and looked at it like he'd forgotten how it got there. "When you leave," he said, "you'll go into another assignment and my people will probably never hear about it." "Probably not. But you'll know about it." "Yes. And the people whose lives depend on you doing it correctly will know about it, even if they don't know it's you." "That's generally how it works." He set the mug down. "Okay," he said. It came out like the end of something, the period at the close of a long sentence that had been trying to find its own conclusion for the better part of 2 days. "Okay." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame in the same place Briggs had stopped the night before. And for a half-second, Elena had the odd sense of the building itself becoming a kind of threshold that people pass through on their way to becoming different versions of themselves. Cross. Captain. "The position on the north slope where you found the observer." He looked at the door frame. "What would you call that position, if you were going to name it?" She thought about the question. It was an odd question, not tactical, not administrative, personal, almost, in the way that the names people give to places are always slightly personal. "I wouldn't name it," she said. "It's just ground." He nodded. "Right," he said, and walked out. The afternoon moved at its own pace. Briggs left Iron Ridge at 1600, a brief departure with minimal ceremony. He appeared at the landing pad with his bag, boarded the helicopter that had come in for a routine logistics run, and was gone before most of the base knew he was leaving. He found Elena at the range, which was Iron Ridge's euphemistic name for a stretch of marked terrain at the base's eastern edge where operators could zero weapons and run drills. She was at the far end, not shooting, standing with the rifle in a carry position, looking down the range toward the target line. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. "The citation went through," he said eventually. "I know. It will be classified at program level, nothing in your transferable record, the way you prefer." "Yes." "You should know," he said, "that this operation is going to generate attention at levels above this command, the engagement distances, the tactical outcome given the ambush conditions. People are going to want to understand how a platoon walked out of Black Ravine intact when the setup was designed to ensure they didn't." He paused. "Your name will remain protected, but the event won't be invisible. Events rarely are. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the program's next assignment for you is going to reflect the attention this operation generates, that the next task is going to be larger." She looked down the range. "Larger. Higher visibility. Higher stakes. The kind of operation that doesn't get assigned to operators who haven't demonstrated a specific level of capability under specific conditions." He looked at her profile. "You just demonstrated it, very publicly, in front of a theater-level audience." "I know. Does that concern you?" She thought about it. The range was quiet. The wind off the mountain was consistent, 6 or 7 kilometers from the northwest, the kind of steady, uncomplicated wind that a rifleman loved because it said what it meant and stayed where it was. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because it's the same shot," she said. "Whatever they call it, whatever the stakes are, whatever the distance, it's the same shot, same preparation, same patience, same moment." She adjusted her grip on the rifle. "The stakes don't change the fundamentals. If I let the stakes change the fundamentals, I miss." Briggs was quiet. He had the look of a man hearing something confirmed that he'd suspected for a long time. Not surprise, but the particular satisfaction of a belief that has been tested and held. "There's one more thing," he said. "Go ahead." "The analyst, Decker. She's filed a recommendation through intelligence channels. She's requesting that your program file be reviewed for an expanded operational authority level, the kind that gives the program more flexibility in how and where you're deployed, with fewer routing constraints." He paused. "She doesn't know the full extent of your record. She based the recommendation on what she observed in the 30 minutes she spent with you in this armory this morning and on what she understood from the mission outcome." Elena looked at him. "She wrote..." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "She wrote, 'The operator in question demonstrated a quality of judgment and situational understanding that exceeded anything I have encountered in 15 years of working alongside special operations personnel. It is my professional recommendation that this asset be given the widest possible operational latitude, because the value of her judgment in complex environments is directly proportional to her freedom to exercise it. He folded the paper and put it back. A 15-year intelligence professional who spent 3 days in a hostage situation and walked out of it because of 2 shots she never saw fired. I thought you should know. Elena looked at the range. She didn't have to do that, she said. No, Briggs agreed. She didn't. He let that sit for a moment. Then, your flight is at 1400 tomorrow. Sleep tonight. I will. He started back toward the base, stopped after 3 steps. Cross. Sergeant Major. He turned and looked at her, fully, in the direct way he'd looked at her on the landing pad the night before. The look that saw the whole thing rather than the parts. You did good work, he said. I know you don't need to hear it. I'm saying it anyway. She held his gaze. Thank you, Sergeant Major. He walked back to the base. She stood at the range for another 20 minutes, watching the wind move through the target markers down the line, learning its pattern the way she learned every wind's pattern. Not because she was going to shoot, but because it was the kind of attention she paid to the world as a matter of course. The way some people notice faces and some people notice architecture, and Elena Cross noticed the way air moved through space. Then she went inside. Dinner was the first meal she'd eaten in the common area since arriving at Iron Ridge. Not by design, she'd simply run out of tasks to perform alone, and the common area was where the food was. She took her tray to the end of a table near the window and ate without particular awareness of the room's reaction to her presence, which was the specific reaction of a group of people trying to behave as though nothing had changed while clearly conscious that something had. Torres sat down across from her after approximately 4 minutes. He put his tray down without asking, which was the correct way to do it. Asking would have created a formality that didn't fit. He was quiet for a moment, eating. Then, I've done 3 combat deployments, he said. I've worked with a lot of snipers. Different programs, different backgrounds. Elena ate. The best one I ever worked with, before yesterday, had a record shot of 920 meters under standard conditions, clear weather, stable wind. He took a drink of water. I thought that was exceptional. She said nothing. 1114 meters, he said. Variable crosswind. Ambush in progress. Target partially masked. 31 seconds from trigger event to engagement. He shook his head slowly. How do you train for that? You train for the components, she said. You don't train for the specific scenario. You train your wind reading until it's reflexive. You train your position until it's automatic. You train your trigger until the break is so clean you could do it asleep. She cut the edge off whatever protein the kitchen had produced that evening. Then when the specific scenario happens, you're not thinking about the shot. The shot is what happens after the thinking is done. When is the thinking done? When I'm in position and I have a complete picture of the problem. She ate. Before that I'm working, after that I'm executing. The transition between the two is the thing people usually call the shot. Torres considered this. Most people experience that transition as a decision. It is a decision. You make it sound like it isn't. It's a decision that happens fast because the information processing that enables it happens slowly, before the decision was required. She looked at him. Most people wait until the decision is in front of them to start processing the information. I start processing it when I get off the helicopter. He was quiet for a while, then, You stood outside last night listening to the wind. Callahan told you. Callahan told everyone. She looked out the window. The mountains were going dark in the way they went dark at this altitude. Not gradually, but in a progression of sudden stages, as though someone was dimming a series of lights in sequence. First the high peaks lost their color, then the middle slopes. Then the valley floors sank into shadow, while the upper ridges held the last of the light, like a tide going out. Is that what the program teaches? Torres said. Or is that just you? She thought about it. The program teaches the technical framework. The rest is... She paused. The rest is what you build inside the framework because you're the one who has to live in it. What does that mean? It means the program can teach you how to read wind. It can't teach you to want to stand in the dark for 45 minutes to read it better. She picked up her water. That part's on you. He ate the rest of his meal without speaking, which she found she didn't mind. Torres was the kind of person who went quiet, because he was thinking rather than because he'd run out of things to say, and thinking was something she had no objection to. When he left, he took his tray and said, "Good work, Cross." "Thank you." He went. Kowalski came after, in the way that Kowalski moved through life generally, without apparent agenda, ending up in places because something had oriented him in that direction, and he'd followed the orientation. He sat where Torres had been and didn't bring a tray. He'd already eaten. He had a cup of something hot that steamed in the way that the cheap hot chocolate from the supply point steamed, not quite convincing, but warm enough to matter. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that I will completely accept the answer, none of your business. Ask. Do you ever get scared?" The question landed cleanly, without decoration. She looked at him and he looked back, and there was nothing in his face except the genuine curiosity of a person who has watched something extraordinary happen and wants to understand the inner mechanics of it, not for any operational reason, but for the purely human reason of wanting to know what kind of person can do what he'd watched her do. "Yes," she said. He nodded, like that confirmed something. "When?" "Before I know what I'm dealing with. In the gap between arriving somewhere and understanding it." She set her fork down. "Once I understand what I'm working with, the fear converts. It becomes something more useful." "What does it convert into?" "Attention," she said. Scared and paying very close attention are almost the same physiological state. The difference is what you point them at. He held the cup in both hands, warming his palms. "I've been trying to learn guitar for 2 months," he said, "and I'm terrible at it." She looked at him. The non sequitur was deliberate, she understood. A way of offering something personal in return for something personal. The way people do when they want to acknowledge that an exchange has occurred without making it too heavy. "G, C, and D," she said. "G, C, and D," he agreed. "The transition between G and C. Your third finger is leading too early. You're anticipating the change before the beat requires it. It makes the G chord muddy at the end." He stared at her. "You can hear that from across a room over a movie and a room full of operators. I told you. I pay attention to things." He shook his head slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, that's... yeah." He drank from his cup. "Third finger. Leading too early. Got it." He stood. "Thank you. For the guitar note and for..." He gestured in the general direction of Black Ravine. "For all of it. Get some sleep, Kowalski." He went. The next morning came in gray and cold with a cloud ceiling that sat low on the peaks, the kind of mountain morning that felt like the landscape was still deciding what it wanted to be. Elena was up at Yo 5:30, packed and ready by Yo 6:15, and spent the remaining time before her 1400 departure at the equipment bench performing a final zero check on the rifle, not because she had any reason to believe the zero had shifted, but because it was the last task and it needed to be done. Hale found her there at Wo 900. He was in a different state than he'd been the previous 2 days. Not looser exactly, but differently organized. The particular reorganization of a man who has worked through something difficult and come out the other side without having resolved it so much as integrated it. He had a folder. "Theater Command responded to the after action," he said. He set the folder on the bench. "The recommendation about the supplemental brief protocol. Already?" Farrell worked fast. He apparently had his own opinions about the information gap, and the after action gave him the vehicle to express them. He opened the folder. "They're not implementing a formal change to the protocol. That'll take longer and requires program-level coordination." He looked at her. "But they issued an interim directive. Receiving commanders at 05 and above who are assigned a program attachment will receive a classified verbal brief from program liaison before the operator's arrival at the receiving commander's clearance level without compromising the operator's transferable record." Elena looked at the folder. "That's not nothing." "No," Hale said. "It's not nothing." He closed the folder. "You won't see the change. You'll be somewhere else by the time it affects your assignments. But the next operator who goes through what you went through, the next time someone shows up to a unit with a sanitized jacket and gets handed the dead-end position because nobody knows what they're working with, it might be different." She was quiet for a moment. "You pushed for that." "Farrell pushed for it. I gave him the material." He looked at the rifle. I was also told that my recommendation for an independent review of Black Ravine's pre-mission intelligence product has been accepted. The confidence assessment on that sector is going to be reviewed. Someone apparently had a problem with the fact that a well-organized ambush existed in a sector that was assessed at 70% clear. Good. Yeah. He put his hands in his pockets. Someone could have been hurt by that assessment. Someone was hurt by that assessment. Webb's keeping the leg. This time. He nodded. This time, he agreed. He looked at her. I wanted you to know, before you left. She closed the cleaning kit, placed it in the pack. Thank you, Captain. Marcus, he said. She looked at him. My name is Marcus. He said it without apparent weight, as though it was a simple thing, which it was and also wasn't. You're not my subordinate. You were never my subordinate. The program attached you to my element for an operation, and you performed your function, and you're leaving. There's no rank between us that covers what the last 2 days actually were. She held his gaze for a moment. Elena, she said. He nodded once. Neither of them made anything of it, which was the correct response to a small, genuine thing. He picked up the folder and walked to the door. There's a thing they're starting to say out there, he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the rest of the base. About the ridge position. What are they saying? They're calling it crosspoint. She looked at the bench, at the cleaning kit, at the rifle. Tell them not to. I'm not sure I have the authority to unname something that operators have started calling something. Try. He almost smiled. I'll try. He went through the door. She left Iron Ridge at 14:12, 2 minutes behind schedule because the helicopter's left engine took 3 attempts to spool up properly, and the pilots ran their checks twice before accepting it. She sat on the forward bench with her hard shell case between her knees and her duffel on the seat beside her and her rifle slung across her chest, and she watched Iron Ridge become small through the cargo door's window as the helicopter banked south. 14 hours of presence. 2 shots. A mission that would exist in classified reports at a level most of the people involved would never access, attributed to an operator whose name would remain protected, in the file of a program most people in the military had heard mentioned once, and filed under the category of things that probably weren't real. She watched the mountains until the base disappeared into the terrain, and then watched the terrain until it became a general thing rather than a specific one, and then looked forward. She slept most of the flight, which she'd trained herself to do not because she wanted to, but because the transit time between assignments was the only rest available, and she had learned years ago to take rest when it was available rather than when it felt appropriate. The rifle was between her knees. Her right hand rested on the receiver. Her breathing was even and slow. At some point in the 3-hour flight, Callahan's question came back to her, not as an intrusive thought, but as a thing she'd been turning over since he'd asked it, the way you turn a rock over in your hand, not because you need to examine it, but because the weight and shape of it is interesting. Do you ever get scared? She'd told the truth, yes, before she understood what she was working with. What she hadn't said, what she rarely said to anyone, was the other part. The part that came after the fear converted. The part that felt like standing on the north slope in the dark, with the wind telling her things she'd trained herself to hear, and the world below organized into a problem she understood, and the rifle in her hands that had never once failed her, and the complete and particular clarity that came from having done everything she could do before the moment arrived, and being ready for the moment when it did. That wasn't something she had a word for. She'd tried once, in a year-end program review, to describe it to the program's senior evaluator. He'd listened and nodded and said, "That's competence. Real competence, not the kind people mean when they mean confidence. The kind that comes from knowing the gap between what you're asked to do and what you're capable of, and finding the gap comfortable." She'd thought about that a lot in the years since. The helicopter flew south through clouds that broke and reformed around the peaks, the mountain range passing beneath them like the spine of something vast and indifferent. And Sergeant Elena Cross slept with her rifle in a cargo bay headed toward the next thing, whatever it was, wherever it was, in the absolute and particular peace of someone who knows exactly who they are. Back at Iron Ridge on a rocky shelf in the cliff face above Black Ravine, where the frost still clung to the shaded stone and the wind moved through the crevice the way it had always moved, slow, deliberate, indifferent to what had happened in the valley below. The position that 11 men had started calling Cross Point sat empty and unmarked and exactly as she had left it. No shell casings, no gear, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. Just ground. The kind of ground that remembered nothing and required nothing and waited. The way ground always waits, for whatever came next. She had been there, and then she hadn't, and the mountain didn't know the difference. But the men who had walked out of the canyon below it did, and they would carry that knowledge the way people carry the things that genuinely change them. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but in the changed behavior, the longer patience, the slower judgment, the second look at the person who doesn't look like what they are. That was her legacy. Not the citation in a sealed file. Not the position named in her absence. Not the policy change worked through Farrell's office or the after-action report that Hale had written with more honesty than the system usually demanded. Just men who would look twice now, who would ask the second question, who would sit with the anomaly a little longer before deciding it meant nothing. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The loudest thing about a truly exceptional person is often their silence. You can misjudge what you don't understand, but you cannot outrun what it's capable of. Look twice. Ask the second question. The person you've already decided about